What if the perfect life was the perfect lie? Imagine a successful man, Richard Sterling, who seemingly has it all: a thriving career, immense wealth, and a beautiful, supportive wife. But beneath the surface, a secret affair promises a thrill that money can't buy. He takes his young mistress to the grand opening of the Serafina, the city's most exclusive five-star hotel, for a weekend of decadence. But the biggest shock of his life isn't in his penthouse suite. It's standing in the lobby. Get ready for a story of betrayal, empowerment, and a twist you won't see coming. Richard Sterling believed he was the architect of his own universe. At 42, he commanded a portfolio of commercial real estate that reshaped skylines, and his name was a currency of its own in the high-stakes world of finance. His life was a meticulously curated collection of successes: the tailored Italian suits that draped his athletic frame, the Patek Philippe watch that gleamed on his wrist, and the sprawling glass-walled penthouse with its panoramic views of the city that he had, in his own way, conquered. His wife, Isabella, was the centerpiece of his domestic collection. They had met in college, a whirlwind of library dates and shared dreams. She had been brilliant, with a fire in her eyes and a passion for art history that he found captivating. Over 18 years of marriage, that fire had softened into a gentle, supportive glow. She managed their homes, organized the charity galas that burnished his public image, and provided a serene, predictable sanctuary from his cutthroat world. He loved her, of course. He loved her the way one loves a beautiful, priceless artifact, with appreciation and a certain possessive pride, but without the need to examine its depths too closely. Predictability, he had decided, was the bedrock of a stable life, but it was a dreadful bore for the soul. And so there was Sophia. Sophia Dubois was 26, a whirlwind of impulsive laughter, ambitious energy, and the kind of unbridled admiration that Richard's ego craved like a drug. She was an intern at a rival firm, sharp and hungry, and she looked at him not as a husband or a settled man, but as a titan of industry, a force of nature. With her, he wasn't just Richard Sterling, the man who discussed catering menus with his wife. He was Richard Sterling, the legend. Their affair had been a tightly controlled inferno for the past 6 months. Clandestine dinners in dimly lit restaurants and stolen afternoons in boutique hotels far from their usual circles. Tonight was different. Tonight was a statement. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" Sophia's voice was a breathy whisper against his ear as his driver navigated the sleek black sedan through the glittering city traffic. She was wearing a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, vibrant contrast to Isabella's elegant palette of creams and navies. "I've never been more sure of anything," he murmured, his hand resting possessively on her thigh. "The Serafina is my latest acquisition's crown jewel. I own the land it's built on. Think of it as a private tour." This wasn't entirely true. He didn't own the hotel itself, but his company held the master lease on the prime downtown parcel, a detail too mundane to share. What mattered was the proximity to power, the feeling of ownership. The hotel, formerly the stodgy Grand Astoria, had been gutted and reborn over 2 years, shrouded in scaffolding and mystery. It was reopening tonight under new management, rebranded as the Serafina, and whispered to be the new benchmark for global luxury. He had secured a reservation for the celestial suite under a discreet pseudonym, Mr. Blackwood, a little game that Sophia found thrilling. The car pulled up to a facade of gleaming white marble and polished brass. A legion of valets in crisp, dark uniforms moved with balletic precision. The air buzzed with the energy of the city's elite stepping out of Rolls-Royces and Bentleys. "It's breathtaking," Sophia breathed, her eyes wide. "Only the best," Richard said, the words a familiar mantra. He enjoyed showing her this world, seeing its splendors reflected in her awestruck gaze. It reaffirmed his own status. With Isabella, such displays were unnecessary. She was accustomed to luxury, taking it as a given. Sophia's excitement was a mirror to his own success. He guided her through the grand revolving doors, his hand firmly in the small of her back. The lobby was a cathedral of modern opulence. A soaring 3-story atrium was dominated by a cascading crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen waterfall of diamonds. The floors were a seamless expanse of Italian marble, and the air carried a bespoke scent, a subtle, expensive mix of bergamot, oud, and leather. The low hum of conversation from the city's most powerful people filled the vast space. Richard strode toward the check-in desk, a long marble monolith manned by staff in impeccably tailored uniforms. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a delicious cocktail of power and transgression. Here he was in the open, with his mistress on his arm, at the most anticipated opening of the year. He was untouchable. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "I have a reservation. The name is Blackwood." The young woman at the reception desk, whose name tag read Chloe, smiled politely, but her fingers faltered for a moment on the keyboard. She typed, then frowned. "One moment, Mr. Blackwood." She discreetly picked up a phone, her voice a low murmur. Richard's brow furrowed with impatience. A delay? Here? He was about to make a sharp remark when a man in a perfectly cut manager's suit hurried over, his expression a tight mask of anxiety. "Mr. Blackwood, my apologies for the delay. We are just finalizing some details for your suite." The manager, a man named Peters, was visibly flustered. "Finalizing? I booked the Celestial suite weeks ago. I expected to be ready," Richard said, his tone turning icy. "Of course, sir, it is. It's just that the owner is conducting a final inspection of the VIP floors this evening and wishes to personally welcome our inaugural guests." Richard felt a flicker of annoyance, but also a pang of professional curiosity. The new ownership was a closely guarded secret. Rumor had it that some foreign conglomerate or reclusive billionaire had bought the property. He might even know them. "Fine," Richard clipped, wanting to get this over with. "Where is this owner, then?" Peter swallowed, his gaze darting nervously past Richard's shoulder toward the grand, sweeping staircase. "She is on her way down now, sir." Richard turned, a bored, expectant look on his face. He imagined some stern, older European woman in cooter or a flashy tech billionaire in designer sneakers. He adjusted his tie, his arm tightening around Sophia, ready to deploy the charm that had closed 1,000 deals. A hush fell over a nearby section of the lobby. Staff members straightened their posture, their faces a mixture of reverence and fear. The click of heels on marble, sharp and resolute, echoed in the atrium. A woman appeared at the top of the grand staircase. She was silhouetted for a moment against the light from the mezzanine lounge. She was tall, poised, wearing a tailored midnight blue pantsuit that was the epitome of power and grace. Her dark hair, which Richard was used to seeing in a soft, elegant chignon, was cut in a sharp, modern bob that framed her face. As she descended, the light caught her features, the determined line of her jaw, the calm, unreadable expression in her eyes, the confident set of her shoulders. Richard's blood ran cold. The universe he had so carefully constructed tilted, spun, and then shattered into a million pieces. Sophia's fingers dug into his arm, her voice a confused whisper. "Richard? Who is that? She's beautiful." Richard couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His entire world had been reduced to the sound of those clicking heels on the marble floor. The woman reached the bottom of the staircase. The hotel manager, Peters, rushed to her side. "Madam Sterling," he said, his voice filled with deference, "everything is in order." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze sweeping the lobby with an owner's authority. Her eyes, cool and distant, finally landed on him. They passed over Sophia without a flicker of interest before meeting his. There was no shock, no pain, no anger. There was only the serene, chilling calm of a complete stranger. "Richard," Isabella said, her voice clear and steady, echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of his mind. "Fancy seeing you here." The world for Richard Sterling had always been a predictable chessboard. He was the king, and every other person was a piece to be moved, anticipated, and controlled. But in that single frozen moment, as Isabella stood at the foot of the grand staircase, the board had been flipped. He wasn't the king. He wasn't even a player. He was just a pawn, knocked aside in a game he never knew was being played. Isabella's name, spoken by the manager, Madam Sterling, reverberated in the cavernous lobby. It was a name he had bestowed upon her, a name he thought defined her in relation to him. Now she had redefined it. It was a title, a brand, a seal of absolute authority. Sophia's grip on his arm was vice-like. "Sterling? Did he say Sterling? Richard, what is going on? Is that your wife?" Her voice was a high-pitched, frantic whisper, the thrill of the illicit evening curdling into pure panic. Richard couldn't form a word. His throat was tight, his mind a maelstrom of denial and confusion. This was impossible. Isabella managed menus and charities. She bought art at auctions and arranged flowers in their penthouse. She didn't buy and relaunch five-star hotels. She didn't stand in a lobby full of the city's most influential people and command them with a quiet, steely gaze. The Isabella he knew would have been horrified by this scene. She would have crumpled, cried, or created a scene. This woman was a stranger wearing his wife's face. Isabella took 2 deliberate steps forward. Her eyes, which he once thought he could read like a book, were now shuttered windows, hiding a world of secrets. "Mr. Peters," she said, her voice never rising, yet cutting through the ambient noise. "Is there a problem with Mr. Blackwood's check-in?" The way she said Mr. Blackwood was a masterpiece of subtle mockery, a silken dagger that twisted in Richard's gut. "No, Madam Sterling," the manager stammered. "We were just welcoming him." "I see," Isabella said. Her gaze flickered over Richard again, a clinical, detached assessment. "Well, please ensure our guest receives the full Serafina experience. We wouldn't want his stay to be anything less than memorable." Every word was a perfectly polished stone, hurled with devastating accuracy. The double meaning hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A few people nearby who had recognized both Richard and Isabella began to whisper, their eyes wide with the delicious, unfolding drama. Richard could feel their stares like physical blows. The architect of universes was now the star of a sordid public spectacle. He finally found his voice, a raw, strangled sound. "Isabella, what is this?" She gave him a small, pitying smile. It was the kind of smile one might give a child who had just asked a painfully naive question. "This," she said, gesturing gracefully to the opulent lobby around them, "is my hotel. Welcome to the Serafina." She then turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal so complete it was like a slap in the face. "Peters, walk with me. I want to review the reservation numbers for the restaurant's second seating." As she and the manager walked away, their conversation a low, professional murmur, it was as if a spell had broken. The lobby's ambient hum returned, but now it was laced with Richard's name. He could hear it in fragments, in hushed tones from behind raised hands and champagne flutes. Sophia pulled at his arm, her face pale with shock and fury. "Richard, did you know? Was this some kind of sick game?" "No, of course not. I had no idea," he hissed, grabbing her elbow and steering her away from the check-in desk, away from the prying eyes. His mind was racing, trying to process the impossible. Where did she get the money? How did she keep a secret of this magnitude? The 2 years the hotel was under renovation, his long business trips to Asia, the late nights at the office. It all flashed through his mind, recontextualized. He had seen it as neglect of their marriage. She had clearly seen it as an opportunity. "We're leaving," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. "Leaving, but the suite, the weekend." Sophia protested, a hint of desperation in her voice. The fantasy she had bought into, the powerful man sweeping her into a world of glamour, was dissolving before her eyes. "The weekend is over," Richard snapped, his composure shredded. He practically dragged her back towards the revolving doors, past the curious, judging faces. The humiliation was a physical burn, creeping up his neck. He, who prided himself on control, had been rendered utterly powerless. He had walked into a trap of his own making, laid by the one person in the world he thought he had completely figured out. Outside, the cool night air did nothing to quench the fire in his veins. The valet, seeing them exit so abruptly, looked confused. "Get the car," Richard barked, the sound raw and unfamiliar in his own ears. The ride away from the Serafina was a cocoon of suffocating silence. Sophia sat pressed against her door, as far from him as possible, her arms crossed tightly. The crimson of her dress now seemed garish and cheap. The spell was broken for him, too. She wasn't an exciting escape. She was evidence. She was a co-conspirator in a crime for which he was now the sole person on trial. He dropped her at her apartment building with a curt, "I'll call you." He wouldn't. He knew it, and by the cold look she gave him, she knew it too. The affair, which had felt so potent and significant an hour ago, now seemed like a foolish, juvenile mistake with catastrophic consequences. Alone in the back of the car, Richard pulled out his phone. He scrolled to Isabella's name. My wife, the contact read, a label that now felt like a bitter irony. He pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to her voicemail. Her voice, the familiar warm tone she used for her messages, was a ghost from another life. Hi, you've reached Isabella. Please leave a message. He hung up without speaking. He tried again, voicemail, and again, voicemail. He slumped back against the leather seat, the city lights blurring past the window. He had always seen himself as the sun in their marital solar system, with Isabella a quiet, steady planet in his orbit. He now realized he had been catastrophically wrong. He wasn't the sun. He hadn't even been in the same galaxy. While he had been playing with sparks, she had been building a supernova, and he had just flown directly into its heart. The serene woman he had left in his penthouse that morning was gone. In her place was a formidable stranger, and Richard Sterling, for the first time in his adult life, was utterly, terrifyingly afraid. The elevator ride to the penthouse was an ascent into Richard's personal hell. The polished chrome doors reflected a distorted version of him, a man disheveled, his tie loosened, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The silence of the empty apartment was the next assault. It was usually filled with soft music or the distant comforting sounds of Isabella moving through the space. Tonight it was a cavernous, echoing void. He stalked through the living area, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished hardwood floors. Everything was exactly as Isabella had left it. A book of Renaissance poetry lay on the side table, a silk bookmark peeking out from its pages. A vase of white orchids, perfectly arranged, stood on the console table. It was a scene of serene domesticity, a diorama of the life he thought he had, and it now felt like a meticulously crafted stage set for a play whose final, shocking act had just unfolded. He poured himself a generous measure of scotch, the amber liquid sloshing in the crystal tumbler. The liquor did nothing to dull the sharp edges of his humiliation. He replayed the scene in the lobby over and over. Isabella's poise, her cutting, precise words, the pitying smile. It wasn't the reaction of a woman scorned. It was the reaction of a CEO closing a hostile takeover. She hadn't been emotional. She had been strategic. His anger warred with a terrifying confusion. How? The sheer scale of it was incomprehensible. Buying and renovating a hotel like the Grand Astoria into the Serafina would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Isabella had family money, yes, but it was old money, tied up in trusts and managed conservatively. It was respectable, but not nearly enough for a project of this magnitude. He handled their primary finances. He saw the statements. He would have known. He pulled out his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He logged into their joint accounts, scanning the statements, searching for any massive transaction, any clue. There was nothing. Just the usual, predictable flow of money, household expenses, charity donations, her personal allowance, an allowance he gave her, a fact that now seemed laughably absurd. Frustrated, he slammed the laptop shut. He was looking in the wrong place. The game had been played on a level he hadn't even been aware existed. He paced the length of the penthouse, the glittering city lights outside mocking him. He had always been the one with the secrets, the one who moved silently through a world Isabella didn't understand. He thought of their last anniversary, just a few months ago. He had taken her to Paris for a weekend. He'd booked their favorite suite at the George V, bought her a ridiculously expensive diamond necklace, and felt a magnanimous sense of pride in his own generosity. He remembered her being quieter than usual, a little distant. He had attributed it to tiredness from the flight. He sank onto the plush sofa, the scotch glass heavy in his hand. He remembered her asking him about the old Astoria property during a dinner conversation. "Did you hear the Astoria is finally being renovated?" she had asked, her tone casual, conversational. "It was such a beautiful building. I hope they do it justice." "It's some faceless corporation," he had replied dismissively, more interested in his steak. "They'll probably strip the character out of it and turn it into another glass box. I hold the land lease, but they haven't consulted me on a single thing." He had said it with a hint of annoyance, offended that his unoffered expertise was being ignored. The memory was chilling. She had been probing him, gathering information, right under his nose. Her innocent question had been a masterful piece of reconnaissance. How many other conversations had there been like that? How many of his self-important monologues about his deals, his challenges, his victories, had she listened to, not as a supportive wife, but as a rival studying her opponent's playbook? The woman he had married, the fiery art history student, had not disappeared. He had just stopped looking for her. He remembered their early days living in a tiny apartment, fueled by cheap wine and ambition. She had worked at a small art gallery to support them while he was getting his first company off the ground. She had a keen eye, not just for art, but for value, for potential. She was the one who had encouraged him to take his first big risk, to buy a dilapidated warehouse that everyone else overlooked. That warehouse had become the cornerstone of his empire. He had forgotten that woman. In his ascent, he had remade her in his mind into something that suited his new life. An elegant accessory, a passive partner. He had boxed her in, labeled her, and stored her away. And all the while she had been quietly, patiently, brilliantly plotting her escape. His phone buzzed on the table. He snatched it up, his heart leaping. It was Sophia. "Are you going to tell me what the hell is going on? My phone is blowing up. People saw us." He stared at the message, a wave of disgust washing over him. Disgust for her, for the situation, but mostly for himself. The thrill of their affair was gone, replaced by the sordid reality of the mess it had created. Sophia was no longer an escape. She was a liability, a loose thread that threatened to unravel the last vestiges of his public dignity. He typed back a terse reply. "Lay low. Don't talk to anyone. I will handle it." Handle it? He couldn't even handle the silence in his own home. He walked into their shared bedroom. The king-size bed was perfectly made. On her nightstand was a framed photo of the two of them, taken years ago on a trip to Italy. They were young, smiling, their arms wrapped around each other, the future an open, sunlit road before them. Looking at it now, he felt like he was mourning a stranger. He opened her closet. It was a walk-in space the size of a small boutique, filled with designer clothes, shoes, and handbags, all meticulously organized. It was the wardrobe of the woman he thought he knew. But as he ran his hand over the silk of a blouse, he realized this was just another part of the set. The real Isabella, the one who wore power suits and commanded boardrooms, lived somewhere else entirely. This closet, this room, this entire penthouse. It was her gilded cage, and she had flown out of it, leaving the door wide open for him to see just how trapped he truly was. While Richard was rattling around his cage of glass and steel, Isabella Sterling was in her true element. Her office, situated on the top floor of the Serafina, was nothing like the soft, feminine spaces she inhabited at the penthouse. It was a study in controlled power. Walls of smoked glass offered a god's-eye view of the city, Richard's penthouse a distant glimmer among the constellations of light. The furniture was minimalist and bespoke. A massive oak desk, sleek leather chairs, and a single, dramatic abstract painting on one wall, a swirl of deep blues and defiant golds. Isabella stood before the window, a tablet in her hand, scrolling through the opening night's performance metrics. Occupancy rates, restaurant revenue, social media mentions, everything was exceeding projections. Yet there was no triumphant smile on her face, only a quiet, focused intensity. The scene in the lobby had not been an act of spontaneous revenge. It had been a calculated, unavoidable move in a long and complex strategy. Her second-in-command, David Chen, entered the office without knocking. He was a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his late 30s, with a calm demeanor that masked a razor-sharp intellect. He had been her investment advisor for 5 years, and was one of the few people in the world who knew the real Isabella Sterling. He placed a cup of jasmine tea on her desk. "The Raptors are circling," David said, his voice even. "The city's top gossip columnist just called my office, wanting a comment on Richard's unexpected appearance." "And you told her?" Isabella asked, not turning from the window. "That the Serafina is delighted to welcome all distinguished members of the community, and that we cannot comment on the private affairs of our guests." "Perfect," she said. "Let them speculate. It's free publicity." David studied her for a moment. "Are you all right, Isabella?" Seeing him like that, she finally turned, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine, David. It was necessary. Richard only understands one thing: power. He needed to see, unequivocally, that the power dynamic has shifted. Her journey to this moment had begun not with anger, but with a slow, creeping invisibility. For years, she had been Richard's shadow, his echo. She had poured her own formidable intelligence into his life, scouting properties for him under the guise of casual interest, vetting his business partners at dinner parties, and acting as his unpaid, unacknowledged strategist. She had done it out of love, believing they were a team. The realization that he saw her not as a partner, but as a beautiful piece of decor, had been a slow, painful awakening. The catalyst had been a letter that arrived 2 years ago from a law firm in Geneva. Her great-aunt Elspeth, a woman she had only met a few times as a child, had passed away. Elspeth had been the family eccentric, a brilliant investor who had quietly built a fortune by breaking all the rules. She had never married, never had children, and had seen a kindred spirit in the bright young Isabella she had met decades ago. The letter informed Isabella that she was the sole heir to an estate valued at just over $500 million. The news had been a seismic shock. Her first instinct was to tell Richard, to share the incredible windfall. They could do anything, go anywhere. But she hesitated. The timing coincided with the beginning of his dismissiveness, the first whispers she'd heard of his indiscretions. A cold, pragmatic voice in her head, a voice that sounded remarkably like her great-aunt Elspeth, urged caution. So she had opened a private account in Switzerland. She hired David Chen, recommended by Elspeth's lawyers, a man whose loyalty was to his client, not her husband. And she had started to watch and to listen. She didn't need a private investigator, not at first. Richard was arrogant, and arrogant men are careless. A credit card statement for a hotel he wasn't supposed to be at. A lingering trace of an unfamiliar, cloying perfume on his jacket. The way he guarded his phone. The evidence was a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a truth she had long suspected but had refused to see. The pain was sharp, a profound betrayal that hollowed her out. But beneath the pain, the fire she thought had long been extinguished rekindled. It was the fire of the ambitious girl who had graduated top of her class, the one who saw the world as a canvas of possibilities. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was freedom, it was ammunition. She decided she wouldn't just leave Richard. That was too simple. He had made her feel small and invisible. She would build something so large, so visible, so undeniably hers, that he would never be able to overlook her again. Her gaze had fallen upon the old Grand Astoria. It was a landmark, faded and neglected, but with magnificent bones. And in a stroke of beautiful irony, Richard's company held the land lease. It was the perfect target. With David's help, she formed a shell corporation, Serafina Holdings, registered in Delaware. They navigated the complex purchase of the hotel from its retiring owners, a deal conducted entirely through lawyers and proxies. Richard had been so consumed by a massive project in Shanghai at the time, he'd barely noticed the sale of a relic on his own turf. He had mentioned it in passing, annoyed that the new owners hadn't sought his counsel. Isabella had simply nodded and murmured something sympathetic. For 2 years, her life had been a masterclass in deception. Her charity work was trips to Milan to meet with designers for the hotel's interiors. Her art-buying trips were meetings in Paris with Michelin-starred chefs she was poaching for the restaurant. She studied architecture, finance, and hotel management with a ferocious intensity, absorbing information like a sponge. The long hours Richard was away with his mistress, Isabella was on construction sites, wearing a hard hat over her Hermes scarf, making decisions that involved millions of dollars. David had been her rock, her co-conspirator. He admired her brilliance and her nerve. "This is the most audacious thing I've ever been a part of," he had told her once. "Audacity," she had replied, "is simply ambition that others are too timid to comprehend." Now, standing in her office, the plan had come to fruition. But it was no longer just about Richard. In the process of building the Serafina, she had rebuilt herself. The hotel was a reflection of her own taste, her own standards, her own resilience. "Richard will try to retaliate," David warned, bringing her back to the present. "He'll look for leverage. He'll scrutinize every contract, every permit." "Let him," Isabella said, a flicker of steel in her eyes. "I hired the best lawyers, the best accountants. Every single detail of this enterprise is ironclad. My great-aunt did not build her fortune by being careless, and neither have I." She picked up her tea, her hand perfectly steady. Richard's world is built on the idea that he is the smartest person in any room. It's an assumption that has made him very rich and very vulnerable. He never thought to look over his shoulder because he never believed anyone was capable of catching up, especially not me. She took a sip of tea, the taste clean and calming. The real work was just beginning. Building the hotel was the easy part. Now she had to dismantle a marriage, and in doing so, finally completely set herself free. 3 days after the disastrous opening night, Richard received an email. It was not from Isabella's personal account, but from her new executive assistant. The message was brief and devoid of any emotion, stating that Ms. Sterling would grant him a meeting at 10 a.m. the following day in her office at the Serafina. The formality of it was another calculated jab. He was being summoned. He spent the next 24 hours in a state of suspended animation, oscillating between white-hot fury and a gnawing, unfamiliar fear. He had his own team of lawyers digging into Isabella's activities, searching for the source of her funds, for any weakness, any loophole he could exploit. They came back with nothing. Her corporate structure was a fortress, her financing opaque and sourced offshore, utterly beyond his reach. She had learned from the best. She had learned from him, and then surpassed him. He dressed for the meeting like he was going into battle, choosing his most formidable suit, a dark charcoal gray that made him look imposing. But as he rode the private elevator up to her office, he felt a profound sense of unease. He was walking onto her territory, playing by her rules. The entire hotel was a monument to her triumph and his failure. Isabella's assistant, a polished young woman who looked at him with cool indifference, showed him into the office. Isabella was not seated behind her massive desk in a power pose as he had expected. Instead, she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city. She didn't turn when he entered. "You wanted to see me, Richard?" she said, her voice calm and even. "Don't play games, Isabella," he snarled, the anger finally boiling over. "What do you want? Is this about money? Revenge? What's your price?" She turned slowly, a look of genuine disappointment on her face. "You still think this is a transaction. After all this, you still see the world as a balance sheet." She walked over to her desk but remained standing, her posture radiating a calm authority that infuriated him. "This isn't about a price, Richard. It's about a correction." On the desk between them lay a thick leather-bound folder. She gestured toward it. "Sit down." He remained standing, crossing his arms. "I'm fine right here." Isabella simply raised an eyebrow, her patience clearly finite. "Sit down." The command was soft, but laced with steel. Defeated, he sank into one of the leather chairs. It was lower than he expected, forcing him to look up at her. Another subtle, masterful power play. "I had a choice," she began, her voice measured, almost academic. "When I discovered your extracurricular activities," she said the words with clinical precision, "I could have played the part you assigned me, the weeping, betrayed wife. We could have had a messy public divorce. It would have been dreadfully tedious and undignified for us both." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But that would have been your story, your narrative. I decided I was more interested in writing my own." She opened the folder on the desk. Richard saw neat tabs, financial statements, and photographs. His blood ran cold. "For the past 18 months, she continued, "I've had a private investigator documenting your life, not out of morbid curiosity, but for the sake of clarity. Here," she slid a photograph across the desk. It was of him and Sophia, laughing at a secluded table in a restaurant. The photo was dated. "And here, another photo, this time of them entering a boutique hotel. And this, a bank statement with a highlighted charge for a jewelry store he'd visited, buying a gift that wasn't for his wife. He stared at the evidence of his deceit, laid out so clinically. It wasn't just the affair. It was the pattern, the sheer volume of lies. "The infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement is quite specific," Isabella said, her tone conversational. "It entitles me to a significantly larger portion of the marital assets. Assets which, my forensic accountants have discovered, you have been rather creatively hiding in various offshore accounts to lower your tax burden. An interesting, if illegal, strategy." Richard felt the floor drop out from beneath him. "You wouldn't I?" Her smile was thin and dangerous. Richard, you have fundamentally misunderstood me for nearly 2 decades. Let me be clear. I am not interested in ruining you. I am interested in a clean break, a disentanglement. She pushed a sheaf of papers across the desk. A divorce settlement. This is my offer. It's more than fair. It leaves you with your company, your primary assets, and your dignity, assuming you have any left. You will walk away from our marital properties, the penthouse, the house in the Hamptons. They are mine. You will sign over your shares in 2 joint ventures, which I helped you strategize. In return, this folder, she tapped the leather binder, disappears. The IRS is never alerted to your creative accounting. The gossip columns never receive a single photograph. Your affair with Ms. Dubois remains your private, tawdry little secret. He was speechless. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. She had him cornered, checkmated from every possible angle. She had anticipated his every move, his every weakness, and used it against him. She had used his own tactics, meticulous research, overwhelming leverage, and a cold, emotionless execution. Why, he finally managed to ask, the question a raw whisper. Why go to all this trouble? Why build all this? For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. It wasn't anger, but a deep, profound sadness. Because you made me invisible, Richard. You took the vibrant, ambitious woman I was, and you put her in a beautiful box, and you only took her out when she matched the decor. I didn't build this to punish you. I built it to find her again. I had to become someone you could not ignore, just to remember who I was. The raw honesty of her words hit him harder than any photograph or financial statement. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the woman from their tiny apartment, the one with fire in her eyes. The fire was back, but now it was a controlled, focused flame that could forge steel or burn his world to the ground. You have 24 hours to have your lawyer look this over, she said, her voice returning to its business-like tone. If you try to fight me, if you try to drag this out, I will take everything. Not because I need the money, but because I will not allow you to turn my new life into a circus. The choice is yours. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a hotel to run. She turned and walked back to the window, her back to him. The meeting concluded. Richard sat there for a long moment, the papers heavy in his hand. He had walked in expecting a fight. He had walked out with the terms of his surrender, dictated by a woman he thought he knew, but had never understood at all. He had lost more than a wife. He had lost a war he never even saw coming. The 24 hours Isabella had given him passed in a blur of legal jargon and impotent rage. Richard's lawyer, a bulldog of a man named Frank, confirmed his worst fears. Isabella's settlement offer wasn't just fair. It was, as Frank put it, a goddamn gift. She could gut you, Richard, Frank said, his voice grim over the phone. The evidence of infidelity is ironclad. The financial irregularities she's found, that's not just a divorce court problem. That's a federal problem. Sign the papers. Take the deal and walk away before she changes her mind. Signing those papers was the most difficult thing Richard had ever done. Each stroke of the pen felt like he was signing away a piece of himself, dismantling the empire he had built. He was left with his core company, Sterling Properties, but he was stripped of the lifestyle that had defined him. The penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the art collection, they were all Isabella's now. He was a king exiled from his own kingdom. The news of the divorce broke a week later, framed in a joint press statement as an amicable separation. But the city's elite were not fools. The story of Richard's appearance at the Serafina with a young woman on his arm had already leaked, whispered in exclusive clubs and over society lunches. The official narrative wasn't fooling anyone. Richard Sterling had been publicly and spectacularly dethroned. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Confidence in his world was everything. It was the invisible currency that closed deals and moved markets. And Richard's confidence was shattered. It showed in his meetings. His voice, once so commanding, now had a hesitant edge. His focus, once laser sharp, was now scattered. He would find himself staring out of his office window, his own view now seeming diminished, wondering what Isabella was doing in her sleek office across town. A major institutional investor, a pension fund he had been courting for months for a new downtown development project, pulled out at the last minute. The official reason was market volatility, but Richard knew the truth. The fund's notoriously conservative director, a man who valued stability above all else, no longer saw Richard as a safe bet. He was a man embroiled in a scandal, a man who had been outmaneuvered by his own wife. He was a risk. The loss of the deal was a multi-billion-dollar blow, not just to his finances, but to his ego. It was the first major professional failure of his career, and it felt inextricably linked to his personal one. His relationship with Sophia, which he had tried to keep on ice, finally fractured. She called him, her voice a mix of panic and accusation. "Richard, I'm being ostracized," she cried. "The internship I was hoping for at Peterson and Croft. The offer was rescinded. No one will even take my calls. You said you would handle this." "There's nothing to handle, Sophia," Richard said, his voice weary. "It's over." "Over? Just like that?" she scoffed, her fear turning to anger. "You drag me into your mess, parade me around like a trophy, and when it all blows up, you just cut me loose? I thought what we had was real." Richard laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Real? Sophia, we were a fantasy. You were attracted to my power, my success. You were my escape from a life I found boring. None of it was real." He realized as he said it that he was also describing himself. His entire life had been a carefully constructed fantasy of power and control. Their conversation ended in a storm of insults and recriminations. When he hung up the phone, he felt nothing. No sadness, no regret. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. The affair, which had once felt so vital, now seemed like a cheap and tawdry sideshow. He moved out of the penthouse and into a corporate apartment, a sterile, impersonal space with generic furniture and no character. It felt like a hotel, but without the luxury or sense of purpose. He was living in limbo. The silence was deafening. He would come home at night to an empty apartment and the hum of the refrigerator. There were no orchids, no poetry books, no trace of the life he had so carelessly discarded. One evening, unable to bear the quiet, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city. On an impulse, he drove past the Serafina. The hotel was a beacon of light and activity. A line of black cars was queued up outside. Figures in beautiful clothes moved behind the large glass windows of the lobby. It was a world of glamour and success, a world that was thriving without him, a world his wife had built. He parked across the street and just watched. He saw Isabella exiting the hotel, laughing with David Chen. She looked radiant, energized, completely in her element. She wasn't wearing one of her soft, domestic outfits. She was in a sharp, elegant black dress, looking every bit the CEO. She looked happy, genuinely happy. A profound, soul-crushing realization washed over Richard. He hadn't just lost a wife or a fortune. He had lost the opportunity to know the incredible woman he had been married to. He had been so busy building his own pedestal that he never thought to look down and see the giant she was becoming, right at his feet. His arrogance, his ego, his constant need for more, it had all blinded him. He drove back to his empty apartment. The image of her happy, confident face burned into his mind. He poured a scotch, but this time he didn't drink it. He just stared at it, the amber liquid a symbol of the empty indulgences he had filled his life with. He had reached the pinnacle of success, only to find himself utterly alone at the top, in a kingdom of one. He had not just been outplayed, he had unraveled. And for the first time, he wondered if there was anything left of the man he once was to put back together. The months following the divorce were a slow, arduous education in humility. Richard's world had shrunk. The expansive, global stage on which he had operated was gone, replaced by the four walls of his office and the sterile confines of his corporate apartment. The sycophants who had once surrounded him had vanished, drawn away by the gravitational pull of newer, brighter stars. He was left with a skeleton staff of loyal employees and the stark reality of his diminished empire. The unraveling had forced him to take stock. With the loss of the big pension fund deal, Sterling Properties was vulnerable. He had to sell off two major assets to maintain liquidity, a painful process that felt like amputating limbs. But with each sale, with each step back from the precipice of ruin, something unexpected happened. A weight he didn't even know he was carrying began to lift. He was no longer chasing the next spectacular deal, the next skyline-defining tower. He was forced to focus on smaller, more manageable projects. a historic building renovation in an up-and-coming neighborhood, a boutique office development. These projects required a different kind of skill set, not brute financial force, but attention to detail, collaboration, and a genuine connection to the community. He started visiting the construction sites himself, not as a distant overlord, but as a participant. He learned the names of the foremen, argued over blueprints, and felt the satisfying grit of drywall dust on his hands. He was building again, but this time, it felt different. It felt real. One Saturday afternoon, seeking an escape from his apartment, he found himself walking through a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. He passed a small, independent art gallery, tucked away on a quiet side street. He remembered Isabella dragging him here once, early in their marriage. He had been impatient, bored, eager to get to a dinner reservation. On an impulse, he went inside. The gallery was quiet, filled with natural light. The exhibition was of a young, local landscape painter. The canvases were raw, powerful depictions of the rugged coastline north of the city. Richard walked through the space slowly, actually looking at the art. He was struck by one painting in particular, a stormy sea crashing against dark, jagged rocks. It was violent and chaotic, but in the distance, a sliver of light was breaking through the clouds. It resonated with the turmoil inside him. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" Richard turned. The gallery owner, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, was smiling at him. The artist captures the duality of nature, its fury and its hope. He found himself talking to her, not as Richard Sterling, the real estate mogul, but just as a man in an art gallery. He talked about the painting, about what it evoked in him. The conversation was simple, genuine, and utterly devoid of the posturing and ego that had defined his social interactions for years. He left the gallery feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He started seeking out these small moments of authenticity. He reconnected with his younger brother, a university professor whom he had always condescended to for his lack of financial ambition. They met for coffee, and for the first time, Richard actually listened, asking about his brother's research, his students, his life. He was discovering the richness of a world that existed outside of balance sheets and stock tickers. One evening, he attended a charity gala for the city's Arts Council. It was the kind of event he used to dominate, but now he felt like an outsider. He was nursing a drink in a quiet corner when he saw her. Isabella was across the room, the center of a circle of admirers. She was an honoree that night, being recognized for her revitalization of the downtown arts scene. A project anchored by the Serafina, which now housed a permanent gallery for local artists. She looked incredible, poised, confident, and radiating a genuine passion as she spoke. David Chen stood nearby, watching her with a look of immense pride and affection. A year ago, the sight would have filled Richard with a possessive, jealous rage. Tonight, he felt something entirely different. It was a profound, aching sense of admiration. He was proud of her. He was proud of the woman she had become, the woman she had probably always been. He knew he couldn't stay. His presence was a ghost from a past she had rightfully moved on from. As he was slipping out, she happened to turn, and their eyes met across the crowded room. For a brief second, the noise and people faded away. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. To his surprise, she returned it, a subtle inclination of her head. There was no animosity in her eyes, no pity, just a quiet, mutual recognition. Back in his apartment, Richard sat down and did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He wrote a letter, not an email or a text, but a handwritten letter on simple, plain stationery. "Isabella, I saw you tonight at the gala. You were magnificent. The work you are doing for the city, for the arts, is incredible. The Serafina is a triumph, and it is entirely yours. There are no words to properly apologize for the man I was. My arrogance blinded me to everything that truly mattered, most of all, to you. I see that now. I see the incredible woman I was married to, and I am filled with a profound sense of regret for the years I wasted, unable to appreciate her. I don't write this asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I write this simply to acknowledge the truth. You were right to do what you did. You have built something beautiful, and in the wreckage of the life I built, I am trying to learn how to do the same on a much smaller and, I hope, more honest scale. I wish you nothing but a lifetime of happiness. You have earned it. Sincerely, Richard. He sealed the envelope, feeling as though he had finally closed a chapter. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a declaration of his own surrender, not to her, but to the truth. He was finally learning that humility wasn't about weakness. It was about the strength to see the world in oneself with clear eyes. Another year passed. The city continued its relentless rhythm of change, and so did the lives of those within it. The Serafina Hotel, under Isabella's leadership, became more than just a bastion of luxury. It became a cultural landmark. Its restaurants earned Michelin stars, its gallery launched the careers of promising artists, and its ballroom hosted the city's most important philanthropic events. Isabella Sterling was no longer seen as Richard Sterling's ex-wife. Richard Sterling was now occasionally referred to as Isabella Sterling's ex-husband. Richard, for his part, had found a quiet and unexpected equilibrium. Sterling Properties was smaller, leaner, but more resilient. He had cultivated a reputation for thoughtful, quality renovations, rather than audacious, ego-driven megaprojects. He had sold the soulless corporate apartment and bought a modest but elegant brownstone on a tree-lined street, a home with character and history. He filled it not with expensive art bought for its investment value, but with pieces he genuinely loved, including the stormy seascape from the little gallery. His life was no longer about relentless expansion, but about quiet contentment. He had fewer acquaintances, but the friendships he did have were genuine. The void inside him, once filled with the need for validation and admiration, was now occupied by a sense of self-respect he had earned, not acquired. He never received a reply to his letter, and he hadn't expected one. The letter had been for him a final act of letting go. He followed Isabella's success in the business journals, a distant, respectful observer of the empire she continued to build. He heard through the grapevine that her relationship with David Chen had blossomed into a quiet, steadfast romance, and the news brought him not a pang of jealousy, but a sense of rightness. She deserved a partner who saw her for who she was. Their paths finally crossed on a crisp autumn afternoon. Richard was having lunch at a small cafe, sitting at an outdoor table, reviewing a set of blueprints. The cafe was known for its quiet atmosphere, a haven from the city's frantic pace. He heard a familiar voice, calm and clear, ordering a tea. He looked up, and there she was. Isabella stood at the counter dressed in a simple but elegant cashmere sweater and slacks. She looked relaxed, her hair slightly tousled by the breeze. She was alone. She turned from the counter, and her eyes met his. The moment stretched, silent and uncertain. The old Richard would have been filled with anxiety, ego, or regret. The new Richard simply felt a calm sense of recognition, like seeing a landmark from a country you once called home. She gave a small, hesitant smile and walked over to his table. "Richard, I didn't expect to see you here." "Isabella," he said, his own smile unforced and genuine. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Please join me if you have a moment." She paused, then nodded, setting her cup of tea on the table and sitting down. For a moment, they simply sat in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable, not awkward. "I heard about the Miller Building renovation," she said, breaking the silence. "What you did with that property was brilliant. You preserved its soul." He was taken aback by the compliment. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." He looked at her, the woman who had once been his wife, now a respected peer. "And the Serafina, it's more than a hotel. It's a masterpiece. You did more than do it justice. You gave it a new life." "I received your letter," she said softly, her gaze direct. "Thank you for writing it. It was a graceful way to close the book." "It was the truth," he said simply. They talked for nearly an hour. Not about the past, not about their marriage or the divorce. They talked about architecture, about the changing face of the city, about art, about business. It was the kind of conversation they might have had 20 years ago in their tiny apartment, full of ideas and mutual respect. He saw the brilliant, passionate woman he had first fallen in love with, and he realized with a pang that she had been there all along. As she prepared to leave, she paused. "You seem well, Richard. You seem content." "I am," he admitted, and was surprised by how true the words were. It turns out that having everything you want and having everything you need are two very different things. It took me a long time to learn that. It's a lesson worth learning, she said with a gentle smile. She stood up, gathering her things. Goodbye, Richard. Goodbye, Isabella. He watched her walk away, a woman of grace, power, and substance, her own person in every sense of the word. There was no lingering bitterness, no sense of what might have been. There was only a serene acceptance of what was. Their story had not been a romance that failed, but a complex, painful catalyst that had forced them both onto the paths they were meant to walk. She had built an empire of glass and steel, and in doing so, had taught him how to build a life out of the rubble of his own. Their connection was no longer one of love or marriage, but of a shared, transformative history. And in that quiet, sunlit afternoon, Richard Sterling finally understood that true wealth was not in owning the world, but in finding your authentic place within it. From the ashes of deceit, both Richard and Isabella discovered something more valuable than wealth, their authentic selves. His downfall became the foundation for his humility and growth, while her quiet rebellion blossomed into an empire built on her own terms. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes our lives have to be completely dismantled before we can rebuild them into what they were always meant to be, proving that the greatest success is living a life true to oneself. If their dramatic story of transformation, resilience, and connection moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a story of epic personal growth. What did you think of Isabella's ultimate power move? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more romantic fiction novels that will keep you on the edge of your seat.